The Dallas County Courthouse pulsed with its usual morning rhythm, lawyers rushing to their next cases, clerks filing paperwork, and the low murmur of conversations filling the corridors. But the moment Officer Karen Mitchell shoved open the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B, all of it came to an abrupt halt. Her boots struck the polished marble floor with military precision, echoing through the chamber as she marched forward, her grip unrelenting on the arm of the handcuffed suspect she dragged before the judge. 15 years on the force had taught her one rule above all: trust your instincts. And every alarm in her head had gone off the moment she saw this man. Mitchell threw her shoulders back, standing tall. "Your Honor," she announced, her voice carrying the sharp authority of someone accustomed to control, bringing in a suspect for suspicious behavior. Possible obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. Her fingers dug into the man's arm, a habit formed from years of dealing with criminals who, sooner or later, always lashed out. But this one didn't. He stood tall, still, unbowed. Even in cuffs, he radiated the kind of calm that unsettled her more than outright defiance. A dusty cowboy hat was pulled low over his eyes. His beard, flecked with gray, hid the hard lines of a face that had seen decades of battle, both in life and, somehow, on screen. His worn denim shirt, faded jeans, and well-worn leather boots made him blend in, just another aging drifter who'd made the mistake of crossing her path. Or so she thought. A ripple of murmurs tore through the gallery. Something wasn't right. Judge Martinez, a man known for his composure, froze mid-motion, his hand reaching for the gavel suspended in the air as if time itself had stopped. A clerk dropped his pen, the metallic clatter unnaturally loud in the charged atmosphere. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered motionless over the keyboard, as if typing the name of the accused had suddenly become a crime in itself. Mitchell's certainty wavered. She turned her head slightly, glancing down at the man she had cuffed, really looking at him for the first time. And then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head, the hat tilted back just enough for the harsh fluorescent lights to catch his face. Mitchell felt the world tilt beneath her feet, the beard, the eyes, the unshakable presence, eyes that had been on television screens across the world, eyes that had stared down villains, criminals, entire armies. Chuck Norris, the man who had trained half the force in hand-to-hand combat, a living legend, a martial arts icon. And she had slammed him against his own truck, cuffed him, and paraded him through the courthouse like a common criminal. The color drained from Mitchell's face. The phones came out, cameras rolling, capturing every second of what was about to become the biggest mistake of her career. The moment everything changed 2 hours earlier, the Texas morning sun had cast long shadows over Highway 121. Mitchell had been in her patrol car, eyes scanning the passing vehicles like a hawk. And then, the truck, a beat-up old pickup, moving at the exact speed limit. Too perfect. Her instincts kicked in. She pulled out behind him, flashed the lights. The truck eased over smoothly, professionally, too smoothly. Mitchell's grip tightened on her holster as she approached. "License and registration," she barked, eyes locked on his reflection in the side mirror. The man, motionless, hands visible on the steering wheel, nodded once. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that only made her suspicion flare hotter. Something about him set her on edge. "Faster," she snapped when he moved, too carefully to reach for his papers. "What's taking so long?" The man paused, turned his head just slightly. "Just being careful, officer." His voice held a calmness that felt like a challenge. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings. That was it, the tone, the unshaken gaze. She didn't just suspect something was wrong. She knew it. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered. "Is there a problem?" Now, he obeyed, too smoothly, too easily. Before he could fully stand, she had him against the truck, arms yanked behind his back. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice still dangerously calm, not resisting, not afraid. "Shut it." The cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. "We've had reports of suspicious activity." She was so focused on asserting control, on maintaining her authority, that she missed the signs. The gathering crowd, the whispers, the phones recording, the Walker Texas Ranger crew pass hanging from the rear view mirror. the sticker on the bumper for a martial arts dojo. And now, standing in courtroom 4B, before the stunned Judge Martinez, before a gallery of gawking reporters, and before the very man who had trained more officers than she had arrested, Mitchell felt the full weight of her mistake crush down on her. The judge leaned forward. "Officer Mitchell." His voice was too calm, too measured. "Would you like to read the name of your suspect aloud?" The words hit like a gunshot. Mitchell's throat went dry. Her fingers barely gripped the notepad as she forced herself to look down at the name written in black ink. Her pulse pounded. Her breath caught. Because there it was. Charles Norris. Chuck. Freaking Norris. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Martinez sighed and shook his head. "Take those cuffs off him." Now. Mitchell hesitated. She had spent her entire career making snap judgments. This time, she'd chosen the wrong man. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the key. The moment the cuffs clicked open, Chuck Norris rubbed his wrists, then turned those legendary steel blue eyes directly to hers. "You were so sure, officer." His voice was low and unreadable. "Maybe next time? You should ask a few questions first." The gavel slammed down. Process closed. But for Officer Karen Mitchell, her nightmare had only just begun. The courthouse walls felt like they were closing in on Officer Karen Mitchell. The weight of her mistake settled deep in her chest, heavier than the Kevlar vest she'd worn on duty for the last 15 years. She hadn't even read the license properly. Her grip on the confiscated paperwork tightened, her pulse thundering in her ears as she forced herself to look down. The name blurred for a second before snapping into focus, as sharp and unmistakable as a bullet casing left at a crime scene. Carlos Ray, Chuck Norris. Her head jerked up. For the first time, she really looked at him. The hat no longer cast its shadow, and those features, those impossibly familiar features, stood out in stark relief under the harsh courtroom lights. She had spent her entire childhood watching that face, on television, in movies, on posters pinned up in her martial arts classes as a kid. And now she had him in handcuffs. The gallery erupted. The murmurs of shock escalated into a crescendo of disbelief. A reporter from the Dallas Morning News was already scrawling furiously in his notebook. The bailiff, a 20-year veteran, stood stiffly near the judge's bench, his face a mixture of shock and thinly veiled disapproval. But it wasn't aimed at Chuck Norris. It was aimed at her. Judge Martinez cleared his throat, the deep gravel of his voice cutting through the rising noise like a gavel strike to the soul. "Mr. Norris," the judge addressed him directly, his tone completely transformed. Measured. Careful. "I must apologize for this situation." "Would you like to press charges?" A tense silence gripped the room. Every camera phone in the gallery was raised, capturing the defining moment of Officer Karen Mitchell's career. Chuck Norris stood still, shoulders squared, his presence somehow filling the entire space despite the steel cuffs still binding his wrists. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of earned respect. "No, Your Honor." Mitchell's breath caught. For a fleeting second, relief threatened to break through the dread, but it was quickly crushed by his next words. "But I would like to say something." The judge gave a slight nod. Every single eye in courtroom 4B locked onto Chuck Norris. Karen Mitchell felt her world shrink. "I've spent my life teaching that true strength isn't about domination," Norris said, his blue steel gaze locking onto her. "It's about protection, about serving others." Mitchell couldn't move. "I've trained countless law enforcement officers. Taught them that authority comes from wisdom, not force." The words hit like a series of body blows. She remembered now. That poster in her police academy classroom, the one with his quote about power and responsibility. She had sworn by those words once, before the job hardened her. Before the world turned into threats and suspects instead of people and lives. "Remove those handcuffs," Judge Martinez ordered, his voice carrying an edge of disappointment that cut deeper than she expected. Her fingers fumbled with the key, hands trembling slightly as she unlocked the cuffs. Chuck Norris didn't move an inch, didn't shift his weight, didn't even rub his wrists once the cuffs clicked free. He just turned, faced her fully. "Officer Mitchell," he said, his tone low and steady, impossible to ignore. I think we need to talk." And just like that, Karen Mitchell wanted to run. The invitation, the morning sun stretched long shadows over the Lone Wolf Ranch, Chuck Norris's legendary training facility outside of Dallas. The gravel crunched beneath Mitchell's boots as she stepped out of her squad car. For the first time in 15 years, her uniform felt wrong, like armor that no longer belonged to her. The practice yards in front of her were alive with movement. Groups of students, children, teenagers, adults, flowed through martial arts drills with fluid precision. Some sparred under the watchful eyes of instructors, others stretched in quiet meditation. And on the front porch, watching her approach with a calm that unnerved her more than a gunfight, stood Chuck Norris. He wore a simple black gi, no belt, no insignia of rank, no badge. But his presence commanded more respect than any police chief she'd ever met. "Welcome to my world," he said as she reached the steps. She hesitated, standing awkwardly on the edge of the porch, waiting for instruction. "First rule," he continued, arms crossed, "leave your badge in the car." Now, a flicker of defiance shot through her. "Sir, you're not Officer Mitchell here." He cut her off, his voice firm but calm. "You're just Karen, a student like everyone else." Her jaw clenched. She had spent her entire career proving she was in control, but here in this place, she wasn't. With a slow exhale, she turned back to her car, opened the door, and unclipped her badge from her belt. It felt heavier than it ever had before. She set it on the seat, closed the door, turned back to Chuck Norris. He nodded once. "Good, let's begin." Inside the main building, everything was different from any training facility she had ever stepped into. No tactical maps, no crime reports, no cold efficiency. Instead, the walls held quotes, principles of discipline, honor, respect. In the far corner, a group of teenagers practiced their stances. Mitchell's steps slowed as her gaze landed on a boy no older than 15, executing a perfect roundhouse kick. She had seen him before, arrested his older brother last year. Chuck noticed her expression. "Surprised?" he asked. She nodded, her voice hesitant. "Yeah, I guess I am. Many of these kids were on the wrong path," Norris said, watching them. They didn't need handcuffs. They needed guidance. Mitchell frowned, watching the young fighter land his next strike with grace and confidence. "How?" Chuck Norris turned to her, his eyes steady. "By teaching them what real strength is." Mitchell swallowed hard. For the first time since that disastrous arrest, she wasn't sure who was the teacher and who was the student. And for the first time in years, she was ready to learn. Karen Mitchell's throat went dry. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had instinctively locked Sarah Chen into a control hold, the same way they had countless others. Too fast, too automatic. She had felt the fear of the incoming strike and reacted. Not with control, not with wisdom, with force. And now Sarah stood there, trembling, tears threatening to spill over. "Just like you did to my dad." The words were a dagger. Mitchell stepped back immediately, releasing Sarah like she'd been burned. The dojo was silent. The other students had stopped mid-exercise. The only sound was the shallow, uneven breathing of the girl in front of her. Chuck Norris approached slowly, his expression unreadable. "Karen," his voice was calm, but she could feel the weight behind it. "Why did you react that way?" Mitchell opened her mouth. No words came. Her heart pounded like a drum in her ears. Every instinct, every reflex, every bit of training that had been drilled into her for the past 15 years told her she had done the right thing. Control the suspect, neutralize the threat, maintain order. But Sarah wasn't a threat. She never had been. And yet Michelle had done it anyway. Her voice cracked. Chuck waited. The entire room waited. Her chest tightened. Something inside her was unraveling. Fast. I was afraid. The moment she admitted it, her body went still. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, watching her warily. "What were you afraid of?" Chuck pressed. Mitchell forced herself to look at Sarah. At the girl she had seen only as a suspect's daughter. At the girl who had looked helpless the night her father was taken away, in cuffs. At the girl who had screamed at her, filled with rage and pain. Mitchell's lips parted slightly as the realization hit her. "I wasn't afraid of getting hurt," she whispered. She wasn't afraid of Sarah. She was afraid of being wrong, afraid of losing control. Yeah. Afraid that all the years she had spent armoring herself behind authority, behind a badge, behind force, had turned her into something she never wanted to be. Chuck let the silence settle. Then he spoke. Fear isn't weakness, Karen. But refusing to face it is. Mitchell exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging like she had been holding up the weight of an entire city for years. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had no shield, no badge to hide behind. Nothing but the raw truth of who she was and who she could be. Again. Chuck's command was simple. Mitchell turned to Sarah, meeting the girl's eyes. This time, when Sarah raised her fist, Mitchell didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't try to control. She simply let the fear pass through her. And for the first time in her career, Karen Mitchell didn't feel the need to fight back. The turning point, by the time the fourth day arrived, Karen Mitchell was a different person. Her muscles ached from unfamiliar movements. Her mind spun from lessons that challenged everything she had learned in law enforcement. But she didn't resist it anymore. She was ready to listen, and more importantly, ready to change. Morning training began at dawn. Mitchell moved through drills with the others, no longer hesitant, no longer second-guessing. When Chuck partnered her with Marcus Thompson again, the same kid she had once arrested for loitering, she didn't try to dominate him. She let herself learn from him. And when Sarah Chen paired with her again, there was no tension, no wariness, only mutual respect. Mitchell hadn't expected that to be the hardest part. Not the training, not the exhaustion, but learning to see people differently, not as suspects, not as threats, but as people who just needed to be understood. By the fifth day, something happened that she never expected. She caught herself laughing. It was a small moment, a joke Marcus cracked about her footwork, but it was enough to break something open inside her. The weight on her chest had started to lift. She had come here as a cop, she was leaving as something else entirely. And for the first time in years, that didn't terrify her. Final lesson the last morning at Lone Wolf Ranch, Chuck Norris called Mitchell aside. She followed him to a quiet area behind the dojo, where the morning sun cast golden light over the Texas plains. You ready to go back? Mitchell hesitated. She didn't know how to answer that. Chuck nodded, as if he understood. You've changed, he said simply, but the real test isn't here. He gestured toward the ranch, the students, the world she had come to know over the past week. It's out there. Mitchell swallowed hard. She knew what he meant. The moment she stepped back into her uniform, back onto the streets, back into her old world, would she be able to hold on to what she'd learned? Chuck studied her carefully. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I had this on my wall when I was your age, he said. Mitchell took it, unfolding it carefully. It was a quote. A badge, like a black belt, isn't a weapon. It's a responsibility. Power means nothing if it's not used to lift people up. Her throat tightened. She had read those words before. Years ago, back when she still believed them. Mitchell clenched the paper in her fist, her resolve hardening. Thank you, she said softly. Chuck just nodded. Go do the right thing, Officer Mitchell. For the first time in 15 years, she knew exactly what that meant. Mitchell stared at the floating leaf, its delicate movements mirroring something inside her, something shifting, something finally at peace. Chuck's voice was calm, steady. Your brother's story didn't end with his death, Karen. Mitchell swallowed hard, the familiar tightness in her throat returning. And he's still here in the choices you make, in the lives you touch. She clenched her fists, feeling the worn fabric of her gi against her palms. But I spent so many years trying to fight fate, she admitted. Trying to force things into place. If I had known then what I know now, Chuck shook his head. We all carry regrets. The question is, what do you do with them? Mitchell exhaled slowly, watching the leaf drift across the pond. I don't know, she whispered. Chuck smiled. You will. Sure. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their coffee, watching the stars blink into existence over the Texas sky. And for the first time in years, Mitchell didn't feel the need to hold on so tightly. She let go, just a little, and the world didn't collapse. It simply kept turning. The return, by the time she packed her bag the next morning, Mitchell felt different. Not just in her body, which ached in ways she had never experienced, but in her mind, her heart. She wasn't the same cop who had arrived at Lone Wolf Ranch. The badge she had once seen as a weapon, as armor, now felt like something else entirely, a responsibility. Chuck met her by the truck as she threw her bag into the back. "Heading out?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. Mitchell nodded. "It's time." Chuck studied her for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "You remember this?" She did. The quote he had given her days ago, now creased from being held too many times. "A badge, like a black belt, isn't a weapon. It's a responsibility." Power means nothing if it's not used to lift people up. Michelle swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yeah," she said, voice thick. "I do." Chuck smiled. "Then go prove it." She nodded once, firm. And with that, she climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove back toward the life she had left behind, ready to do it differently. The first test the city felt different when she returned. Or maybe she was different. The first shift back on patrol, she saw it immediately. The way people looked at her, the hesitation, the fear. It hit her harder now, knowing exactly where it came from. And for the first time, it bothered her. Her radio crackled. A dispute in progress. 5th and Hanover. Possible escalation. Mitchell grabbed the receiver. Officer Mitchell responding. She pulled up to the scene, a familiar one. 2 young men, voices raised, hands balled into fists. The old Mitchell would have stepped in hard and fast. Authority first, control first, but now, she stepped out slowly, hands open. "Hey!" They turned tense, ready for a fight. She met their eyes, steady, calm. "You good?" The 2 men hesitated, thrown off by the lack of aggression in her voice. And in that tiny sliver of hesitation, Mitchell saw her opening. She didn't need to fight them. She just needed to guide them to a different choice. She thought of Marcus. She thought of Sarah. She thought of Tommy. And for the first time in her career, she approached the situation not as a cop, but as a teacher, as someone who had finally learned the difference between power and strength. And as she spoke, as she de-escalated the situation without force, without fear, Mitchell realized something. She had passed the real test. Not at the dojo, not on the mat. Here, out on the mat. Here, out in the world, where it truly matters.